So let me just say that this program today came to us because of Mary Harrison. And I'm really, really grateful, as are all of the Adult Programs Committee, grateful to many of you, including Mary, who have brought programs to us so that we could share it with the rest of the First Church community. I would not have known about Stephen Ratiner until Mary told me about him. And so thank you, Mary. And please, that's a call to anybody else who has any other ideas about people who inspire them, so that we can, especially during the next several months, can get through this time of isolation. So I want to start with, before I do an introduction of Stephen, and by the way, all of you know that you can change the view of who's in the center of your screen by clicking on either gallery or speaker. So if you want to see everybody's faces, that's fine, that's gallery. If you want to just see Stephen as he's doing his presentation, just click on speaker. So I'm going to start with a quote from Shelley about poetry. He said, "Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar." So I will also caution you to mute yourself unless you're speaking, because sometimes there are echoes that happen in your own life. There are phones that ring, and we just would prefer not to hear those things. So we'll have a chance later in the program for you to ask your questions, but I will now just tell you a little bit about Stephen Ratiner. And he is, as a poet and an educator, he has a long-standing commitment to expand the ways that audiences experience the poetry and the arts. He has created collaborative works with jazz and classical musicians, dancers and choreographers, and a variety of visual artists. He's published 3 poetry chapbooks, and his work has appeared in scores of journals and in America and abroad. He's taught as a poet resident in over 300 New England schools, and in 2020, this is important, he was reappointed for a second term as Arlington's Poet Laureate. And so without any further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Stephen, who will tell you a little bit about himself and the relationship to the title of this program. And we're delighted to have you with us, Stephen.
Thank you, Lillian. Thank you all for coming. I was doing, when I was first appointed as Poet Laureate of Arlington, I began trying to hatch ideas for poetry to appear in unexpected places. There are certain people, and I'm sure a lot of you are among them, that probably seek out poetry. You might go to readings, or you're going to browse the poetry aisles. There are other people who would never do that. And that does not mean that poetry might not have something of value to them. So as Poet Laureate, I decided I was going to try to find ways to inject poetry into everyday life that might surprise people. So we had planned a series of little mini pop-up readings in restaurants. We were going to do some site-specific poems so that you might be walking on the street and the signage for a poem that was about that street or about that park or that view of the skyline. I had a number of things planned, including something that I called the red letters. And it was going to be a mailing of 1,000 red envelopes, each with 2 poems, one from an adult, one from a student, to 1,000 random households in Arlington. And I thought no one would turn away from a poem if it arrives in the mail, especially in a hand-addressed envelope. And I thought I would even recommend that if they like that, they can readdress it and send it to another neighbor. And I just thought having poems pop in unexpectedly would be a pleasant surprise. And just when we had the committee ready to do this, COVID struck. And so I put everything on hold. And then less than 1 week in, I felt, as probably most of you felt, we were all quarantined then, I felt the tremendous rise of anxiety and fear and concern, not being able to see people. And I suddenly realized poetry might be even more important at a time like this. So I turned it into a virtual project so that once a week, from poets originally just from Arlington, and then from places like Belmont, Lexington, Watertown, and now from poets all across the state. Once a week, a little red letter poem goes out to people who sign up. I secured a partnership with 7 community and arts organizations. So that meant it was going out to their mailing list or it was appearing on their blogs. So that in the end, the poems were being seen by several thousands of people every time. And then the delightful surprise was that people really warmed to this and they began sending it to friends who would then write back and say, can I be on the list? Can I get them every week? And then we now have people that go string all the way across the country to California and Hawaii, down to Florida. We even have our one first person who signed up from Istanbul, Turkey. So the delight is these little poetry ambassadors bringing a poem a week. And the poems were about originally, I think, poems of comfort as we were all going through this crisis. But then they expanded as the crises expanded, as the political, economic, social crises erupted. I decided the poem should address anything that might be on people's minds. And I think that made it an even more viable, evolving anthology of poems. And because of that, I'd get requests to come read poems. And it was the reading out in the Stockbridge Library, virtual reading that Mary saw, and then she connected me with your congregation. So I'm assuming that you all know something about poems. Some of you might be poets yourself. You obviously are not poetry phobic, or you wouldn't be tuning into this program. But I want to talk a tiny bit about poetry. I'll tell you first a little bit about myself. Tiny bit about poetry, and then I'll tell you about 3 learning resources that added to the subject today. It might seem a little difficult having a whole 45-minute reading based about loss, but it's also loss and renewal, and then about the nature of poetry itself. I called it the breath of a poem. That might be, even if you didn't think contemporary poems might have something for you, might be something valuable to think about. So let me start by I'll read you a quote. I had a wonderful experience. I used to be the poetry critic for the Washington Post, and before that for the Christian Science Monitor. And when I was doing the Monitor series, I did a series about my teaching in schools. It was a year-long series, and it turned out to be very well received. So I came in one day to see my editor, and she said, okay, so now what are you going to do? And if any of you are writers, you know, you never say, you have to act like you've got something you've been planning. It's well thought out. And I said, yes, I have an interview project in mind. I'd like to interview poets, both well-known poets and emerging poets, and speak to them about the idea of giving, the idea of what is given inside language. And the editor said, that sounds great. Who is your list? And I quickly rattled off about 4 or 5 names. And for about 2 years, I got to do this wonderful project. Eventually, a book came from it called Giving Their Word, Conversations with Contemporary Poets. It was the best learning experience, I think, academic learning experience I could ever have had. I never told my editors this, but if she'd asked me to pay her for the privilege of doing this series, I would have done that gladly, because I got to meet many men and women who were my idols in poetry, one of which was Seamus Heaney. And I'm going to read you a quote about something he said about poetry. He said, poetry is born out of the superfluity of language's own resources and energy. I love that. The superfluity, superfluous, extra. But then again, he also has the fluency of the liquidness of the same experience too. He said, it's a kind of overdoing it. Enough is not enough when it comes to poetry. Now, this is the important part. He says the extraness may be subtle or reticent, or it may be scandalous and overdone, but it is always extra. Poetry to me, especially contemporary poetry, that is sometimes written in what appears to be a spoken language, a vernacular, very often now without rhyme or meter, is some people don't like contemporary poetry because they think it's just like speech. It's obviously not just speech. There are thousands of ways of adding the extra to poetry. And one, of course, is music. And the music of the language, the cadences that you form in the lines are based on another thing, breath, how you breathe through a poem. I'll talk about that again later on because I'm going to show you an example of that breathing. But I'll just say, if nothing else, how many words can you put in a breath? So as you're reading a line, if it's a very long line, you're already having to parcel out your breath to make sure you don't run out of breath before the end. Or if it's short lines like this, now I'm putting a very large, forceful breath on just a very few words. But in every case, it means the poetry is creating a physicality. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's touching on your body, your heartbeat, and your breath as a way of you becoming the instrument for the poem, to recreate the poem in your own life as you read it. Hopefully read it out loud. That's my preference, but certainly even when you're reading it yourself. So this idea of a poem being, I think of it as an energy transfer device. If you remember the old Einstein E=mc squared, right? Energy and matter being interrelated. I think that's what a poem really does. So it begins with energy. The energy might just be, I'm sitting out here looking at the bird feeder, and all of a sudden I'm watching the way this one cardinal is looking in, and for some reason on that day, a poem begins. Something about the energy of the world comes into me. And as it starts to filter through me, I do something and I make it happen on the paper. I make it material. Now it's words, ink on paper. Then if you're lucky, it gets published. It's more material. It goes out to the world. And maybe you pick up the poem, and what do? You take that material thing and you read it and you turn it back into energy. Now it's circulating inside of you as a thought and feeling. And if you're lucky, maybe you then turn it back into matter. Maybe you write a poem, or you do a painting, or you do a dance, or even you just have a conversation with a friend, or you copy it and put it in a red envelope and mail it to someone. So the idea of this taking from the world, turning it into something else, and sharing it again, I think is essential to what poems do. I felt like the red letters were doing that because every Friday, once a week, a poem appeared in your mailbox. Not everybody's mailbox, your mailbox. As if one poet was going to be speaking just to you, and his or her poem was going to do this little dance in front of you. And as you read it and thought about it, maybe that energy became something inside of your life at that moment. So I'm going to tell you a tiny bit about my background. I wasn't going to, but Lillian said, remember, we don't know who you are. So I should tell you a little bit. I was born in New York City, then lived for a time in California before I moved back to Massachusetts. I did not come back to stay in Massachusetts. I was moving to Washington State from California to get to a little bit more isolated, more rural an area. But I decided I would probably not see friends and family for a long while. So I took a farewell trip. I drove across the country, circumnavigating the country, intending to go back west and then start a new life up north. Except I hit Massachusetts in autumn. And I was born in New York. I know what autumn is like. You don't feel the seasons the same way in California. And it had such an emotional grip on me. Within about a week, I called up my friends in California and said, can you box up all my things and mail them out to me? And then I never left. I'll tell you something about my father. My father's father ran a dry cleaning business, but he also had a plant that took in dry cleaning. And it meant that my father, as the eldest son, was the one responsible for helping take care of it, while the two younger sons got to go to college and become lawyers. My dad helped with the family business. What was awful about that at the time was benzene was the chemical that was used in dry cleaning, which we now know is an awful carcinogen. And it ended my father's life and his father's life early. My dad died when he was only 50. I was 8. Now, that's too young to understand about the limitation in life, but life is going to give us what it gives us. And because of that, I think I began to be a scientist for this idea of loss and replenishment. Loss became an important theme in my life, and I began writing poems when I was that young. And I think some of what I was trying to do was to draw back my father to me in a poem. Sometimes I'd have to write an angry poem to be angry, how dare you leave me? Or angry at the world, or angry at God. I had to dismiss God because I thought this was done as a punishment, perhaps, the way every young child thinks that the world revolves around him or her. So the poetry became a type of a journey. And I've written about this all my life. And I decided when invited to do this talk today, and I'll read you a couple of little sequences from two full-length manuscripts that are just about finished. One is called Black Quilt, and it was about my sister Elaine. I always used to tease when I was young. I had four sisters, which all my friends, especially the male friends, would be, laugh at. Four sisters, as if, of course, what good would sisters be? And I was kind of proud of it in a way, even though I acted like I wasn't. And now I'm sad to realize I have one sister left in the world. Elaine was one I was close to in an interesting way. And when she was not that old, about 65, she had something in her head called a meningioma, which is a type of growth on the lining of your brain. And normally it's benign, so they can take it out, it goes away, and you live your life. But on a very rare cases, it's not, and behaves the way a cancer would behave. She had several surgeries, and at the end, it took her. From the moment I heard the news, I wrote a poem about her called Sister. I'm going to read it to you in a minute. And then began writing a long series of poems for her that lasted right through her passing, and then even beyond, as I tried to digest this. The name of the book is called Black Quilt. And then I'm going to read you another little sequence about mothers and fathers, and that's from a manuscript called The Smoke Harp. But I'm going to start actually by reading a poem that's not mine and talk about the three sources that I realize I've drawn on, more than three, but here are three main ones that I've drawn on to learn about this in my life. And one is from people that came before you. Poetry and art making is that valuable gift. Others lived before you. They've gone through what we've gone through, even things like pandemics. And because of that, we might learn something that we have not gotten into our lives on our own. And so to me, poetry becomes a very valuable resource. But I'll give you just one example. Here's a poem called Chang Chen Tzu. A tzu is a Chinese poem put to music. And what they would do is they'd recycle old songs from a book called the Shi Jing, one of the most ancient Chinese anthologies. And all the ancient Chinese poems were put to music. So they would take the old music and write a new poem to the old lyric, to the old song, recycling the lyric. And this is from a wonderful poet named Su Shi, or he's also known as Su Tung Po. He was a governor in the south of China. He had a very interesting career of lots of ups and downs. And then this is my favorite poem from him, Chang Chen Tzu. 10 years living and dead have drawn apart. I do nothing to remember, but I cannot forget your lonely grave 1,000 miles away. Nowhere can I talk of my sorrow. Even if we met, how would you know me? My face full of dust, my hair like snow. In the dark of night, a dream, suddenly I am home, you by the window doing your hair. I look at you and cannot speak. Your face is streaked by endless tears. Year after year, must they break my heart? These moonlit nights, that low pine grave. I was tremendously taken by this poem, and I got to visit China twice, and I led a group of educators there once on a tour, and we got to visit a studio of some Chinese artists, and the other teachers on the tour were excited by the art and bought up scrolls and fans and things like that, and I commissioned the artists and said, would you make a scroll for me? And they loved that idea. And there was two brothers. So one was going to do the calligraphy, one was going to do the painting. And they said, what poem do you want? And I said, Chang Chen Tzu. But they looked it up and they found 20 poems online called that, because remember, they recycled those rhythms again and again. So I had to describe it to him. I knew the first line, the 10 years living and dead have drawn apart. And they looked up the poem and they looked at me strangely and they said, wait, you sure this is the poem you want on your wall? I said, yes. They said, do you realize this is a poem about death? I said, yes. But what this poem really is also about life, because though he's missing his young wife, who died very young at 26 years old, they married young in China, married at 15, died at 26. Though he misses her, and he mourns the fact that he says, even if you saw me, you wouldn't even recognize me. Why? Because my face full of dust, wrinkles, my hair like snow, white hair. But then he has a dream. And in the dark of night, there she is again. And that's what I loved about this poem. He didn't have the dream about them boating on the Yangtze River. He didn't have a dream about them when they visited the emperor in the palace. He dreamt about the most everyday thing, the thing he could have seen every day of their married life. Chinese women and men had very long hair. So every night they'd have to take out those pins and brush out that long hair. And I would often show this when I teach to young students, and I'll say, do you think he watched her brushing her hair every night? And I love how fourth graders are very earnest. They'll say, yes. And I'll say, no. Why didn't he watch her? Because it was boring, because it was every day, because we don't know well how to value our everyday lives until we lose it. You know, the expression, you don't miss your water. But now that she was gone, 10 years later, he's still mourning her. I said he would have given 1,000 pieces of gold if he could just for one night watch her stand by the window and brush out her hair. And I told my students, I did something that night that I had not done in years, and I make them guess, and they never can guess. And what did I do? Of course, I watched my wife brush her hair, which of course she did not appreciate. What are you staring at? I realized Susher, who never knew Stephen, who never could conceive of something called America, put this energy out into the world. And it persisted 1,000 years. 1,000 years, just a short bit less than a millennia, about 980 years for this poem. And then here it is in my life, reminding me to pay attention to what's there. So I think my goal in the poems that I'm writing, always they are to take that journey for myself, but also they are to, I hope, turn language into something that can travel out in the world and maybe be useful to some other people as well. So I'm going to read you a couple of poems about Elaine. Here's the very first poem that's in Black Quilt. It's in 2 parts. It's called Sister. That's when I just found out about her diagnosis. 1. By the time they found it, the tumor was the size of a house sparrow cooped inside my sister's skull. As with any growing thing, hunger was its holy order. It consumed until it half filled this airless chamber. It began shredding memories to thatch its nest, passwords, birthdays, not just the place she'd parked the car, but the word for the thing she'd parked there. Moving on, it claimed more substantial matters. Favorite food, favorite color, the dog's name, and then her daughter's. All the sweet particulars the mind once savored, secured, reduced now to split filaments, dry as straw. And what if this sparrow crowds her very soul from its tenuous corner? Where might it turn for some lasting shelter? Blue minarets of delphinium? Or the snug cloister of her sewing basket? Perhaps, 2, as a last resort, a bronze ash-filled vial wedged into a granite wall. If allowed, I'd offer her soul refuge in the veined hollow beneath my tongue. I would teach it to speak back the stolen world. Ripe peach, sea foam, Cheryl Ann, the last of June, Oakdale Road in North Decatur, and here, Angel, come. Elaine was described to me what it was like to go into an MRI machine. And at that time, I had not experienced it. And then I had my own reason to be put into those odd airless chambers. And I wrote a poem from Elaine's point of view. Half of the poems in the book are written from Elaine, and they're encased in quotes, and half of them are from her brother. So this poem is spoken in Elaine's voice. You're going to hear the stanzas broken up by an odd set of expressions that won't make a lot of sense. Like the first one is harrow, anvil, and sledge. But these sounds will eventually come back and let you know what you're hearing. Probably anybody here who's already been in an MRI, though, will know what it was. So here's a poem called Horizontal Tower. The third surgery, 22 hours under the knife, and after the bandages come off, I'm Charles Lawton in the 39 Hunchback, great misshapen gourd of a head, edema, a red fist sealing one eye, and the stubbly gray scalp crisscrossed with scars like a dry riverbed. I was a mess, but breathing. Harrow, anvil, and sledge. I believed in the miraculous then. Something like a second birth, and God, how I ate up those first mornings. But the fluid never drained, and the funny hats did little to temper the horror in the faces when the monster passed. If I'd a bell tower then, believe me. Red furnace, Mama Valkyrie. I waited for beauty to show her face. She did, but only rarely. 3 months later, lounging in bed, and I began to feel it again. Those white tentacular fingers slipping down from temple toward cheekbone, clutching the crown of my head. The surgeon swore it was my imagination, but I knew its touch like remembering a lover's hands. Another month of complaining, and they sprang for a new MRI. Deep inside the clanging machine, I began giving names to the sounds, just as Quasimodo had christened his beloved deafening bells. Worry, worry, the snarl, silk guillotine, and cry from the well. I was told when I came out of the MRI, when I had to do this, that I was the only person that they knew in the history of Mount Auburn Hospital who, upon leaving the machine, sat up and said, "I need pencil and paper." And they said, "What? I need pencil and paper." And they quickly gave me a pad and I started writing. And they thought I was, what, was I going to sue them? I was like, a complaint? No, 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 the poem. Here's White Lies, again in my sister's voice, but there's other voices in here. I'll try to change my voice a little bit so you can hear when my sister's friends are speaking. White Lies, this is much later in the book. They hug me gingerly and say how much better I look. I don't, but love how happy they seem if we, for a moment, believe it together. One friend strokes the ash gray bristle sprouting across my scalp, declaring, "With this dew, you're all ready for summer." And I picture the deep furrows I'll dig across moist black beds, worms writhing up like belly dances, marigold and hyssop, basil and tomato, if I still have it in me for another planting. Here's the friend again. Let's, this summer, when school lets out, drive back up to the lake. We'll quaff pitchers of peach daiquiris, roll up our cuffs, and dangle our feet. And I think of how deep that kettle lake must be, and of the fish who've come to crave such unappeasable darkness. Untouched by the sun, we bluff, warm-fleshed lovers of these passing days devoutly covet. And so I tell her, let's. This poem is benediction after Elaine was gone. We mourn by refusing to mourn. One of us will mention the soup that last Passover. Another smuggling fricassee past the night nurse. We'll laugh, and for a moment become laughter, become that lightning you managed to live all along. Because life, it turns out, is only a sip at a time, a moment's savor. How could we not have known? Because, like your soup, dear sister, too much salt in death's broth. To remember is not to contain, but to become. Finding you in your son, your daughter, in the gnarled dogwood, the flowering plum, piecing together what in past years we might have made rags of, tonight we'll sleep beneath this balm. Should have told you earlier. So Elaine's a quilter, which is why the poem, the book is called Black Quilt and has various poems about quilting and sewing all through it. I always loved the fact that Elaine would not only buy bolts of material when she'd make her quilts, but she would take scraps of things that we gave up. And suddenly the scrap would become a little patch of color in something else. And thus the line that in the years past, we would have made rags of this. But tonight in memory, we are becoming Elaine a little bit. And that was very important for me because Elaine, right until the end, was astonishingly happy. I have no explanation for this. Elaine just found joy in things. I think that's not the case for my other sisters and myself. I think we somehow maybe felt there wasn't going to be enough. And Elaine felt always like she had more than enough to share. What I felt like I was learning from Elaine is that by her going through this experience, she was trying to get me to hold on to it perhaps in a different way. I had one of the luckiest experiences of my life. Near the end for Elaine, her son, a lawyer in Atlanta, rented a big house up in the mountains by a big lake. And he had invited anybody in the family who could come to show up and spend a week there with Elaine. And Elaine said it was the happiest week of her life. And we had a week together, so people were out swimming, doing things. On one day when she was sitting alone in the living room, I just asked her if I could read her the poem. She knew I'd been writing poems about her, and I got to spend an hour or two and read her all of Black Quilt. The energy, even the very dark energy of Elaine having to go through what she went through, entering my life, becoming something else, becoming not just a poem, but then a series of poems, and now a whole book of poems. And then I hope the book will be published, and then maybe getting to visit other households. And I don't know what they will make from this, but I hope maybe something useful. See how we're doing for time. Skip ahead. I'm going to read you a little set of poems about mothers and fathers. It's a longer set. I've just carved it down to 4 poems. Some of them were about specifically my mother and my father, but some about others too. This first one, not about my mom, but about my wife's mom, who suffered near the end of her life from Alzheimer's, which is a different sort of loss, isn't it? Alzheimer's or dementia is taking away from us in the midst of life. It's actually eventually easier on the person going through this because eventually they don't know what they're missing. We do. We see the person disappearing like vapor and leaving only the body left and maybe some of the habits. It's a very hard thing. So here's a poem about that called I Am Momentarily, and the title will run right into the first line. I am momentarily all the people you believe me to be. The other daughter, buried sister, childhood row house friend, and then the good-looking boy who fissured your Milltown heart, the one you held me to 100 lifetimes ago. I am guest at the beginning of a rant, then suspect stranger at the end, where you introduce yourself again and again, asking whether I work here. I smell gardenias, onion, urine. You rebuff my hand. Another hallway cast off, I'm at a loss for words. This morning, we become mother and daughter again, if momentarily, and in someone's half-remembered story. Together, we are the prodigal and the welcome home. We may even be the fatted calf ablaze on the spit and the murmured gratitude to celebrate our very next forgetting. One of the things I learned from that process was we're all going through that. As we age, we don't possess our lives in the same way. And if I've forgotten that thing that I did with my cousin Lenny when I was 8, then I have lost a little piece of that life. One of the advantages of poems, writing of any sort, is when you write something down, it becomes almost indelible. So that from the things, the moments in my life that I've written poems about, they are not just the poem itself, but the memory inside is crystal clear. Here's a poem about my mother called For Now. Near the end, she stopped eating altogether. One evening, when I brought chicken soup shoaled with wild rice, a quick shake of her head, whispering, "What for?" And yet, in sleep, her mouth moved constantly, making a meal of departure. Watching her, I wondered, was the opposite of hunger grief, grace, love, or need? What feeds on our silence? Not that it would have made a difference, but I wish I'd proposed we take turns with the spoon, a mouthful, a mouthful, countering what for with for now. I didn't do that. I wasn't wise enough to suddenly say, Mom, let's eat this together. Had I taken a bite first and offered that, maybe it would have been easier. Maybe we would have shared that. Maybe the taste of that chicken soup would have stayed with me. So the thing that I did not do and cannot do in the world, I can do with words on paper. The materiality of my mother is not there, but the poem is. And every time I read this poem, if I read it to myself, or if I'm reading it to an audience like you today, something of that material moment suddenly is regenerated inside of me. I possess it again in a curious way. Not the same way we possess the water bottle, but maybe in a deeper way. Maybe in a way that, as I said, maybe is a bit more indelible. Here's a poem about losing my dad, but this is written from the boy's point of view, the 8-year-old's point of view. A poet friend, when I sent him this poem, he was really happy with it, but he was most happy with, he says, all sons write poems about losing fathers, all, daughters write poems about losing mothers. He said, but we don't normally hear it from the kid's point of view, the child's point of view. And I try to see if I can put you inside Stephen's head at the time. The poem is called Walk, Don't Walk. The Q5 bus was a behemoth. Mother didn't need to explain to me how it could crush me into paste beneath its massive wheels. She explained it anyway. We stood by the crosswalk waiting. I could feel the red don't flaring inside my eyes, even from a distance. It knew my reckless urges, what a skittish animal I'd become. Mother grasped my hand. I was safe within that grip. Maybe death was like the Q5 bus. I imagined my father, lonely at the kiosk, watching as this green and gold emptiness lumbered up Merrick Road and approached his stop. The pitiless stare of its headlights. Boarding, he didn't wave goodbye. He carried no briefcase. Instead of suit lapels, a hospital Johnny. He'd forgotten his favorite hat. Somehow he'd become small as a boy again, narrow shoulders pinched like a sparrow's. As the bus barged its way into the tangle of traffic, did my father look back through the grimy window to see our faces, to let go of all that was letting go of him? The green declaration, walk. I pulled free of my mother's hand. I did not look both ways before crossing. Sun glare spilling across my eyes. I walked. I kept on walking. Then I ran. I only have fragments of memories of things like that, my mom at a crosswalk. But somehow this poem became large in my mind. Somehow the figure of the walk, don't walk sign, as if there was a godlike figure that was somehow assessing me. I don't know why, it took hold of me. It was powerful for me to imagine something that I did have experience with, the Q5 bus, and imagine maybe death was like that. I'm imagining my father entering it. We've only been through this once. We don't know. It's why we rely on each other, friends, relatives, family. If somebody knows a little bit more, share that. And maybe, as I said, maybe we sometimes can coalesce a little bit into a tiny bit of useful language that can travel. Here's the other great thing that poems can do, though. So if that's Stephen at age 8, here's Stephen today at age 70. The poem is called Starbucks. And now we switch into that other mode, because if poems are about possessing what we are, what we were, our memories, our lives, it's also about being able to fashion something new. when you write something in a poem, you create a new reality. It starts out as just words on paper, but anybody who writes poems will know it becomes a much larger psychic realm. So that here's a poem that could only happen on paper. And the name of the poem is called, a very simple title, Starbucks. I'm meeting my father here. He died nearly 30 years before a place like this ever existed. For 15 cents, he could enjoy a mug of Joe at the Busy Bee, Burton Dave's, the Parkway Diner. But no, more likely I'd find him, dream-worn at his own kitchen table, blue flannel robe, aura of forsythia, pouring a fresh cup, cream, 2 sugars. To an 8-year-old, the coffee smell on his breath seemed intoxicating, alluvial, a bitter intimacy. Now, I find a seat beside the window, buy each of us a tall latte, and sit patiently, watching the corona of our milky foam, sipped by time, retreating. Back when we could have actual readings out in the world, I was so delighted when I'd read this poem in public and people would come up to me afterwards and say, "Did you really buy 2 lattes?" They wanted that to be true. They wanted to feel as if the materialness of that experience could reclaim something so that maybe they too could, imagine the cream of the latte disappearing as time erases. Here's a poem that's a large rush of words with only commas, no sentence breaks. It's called A Soul. It's for the great California poet named Jane Hirschfield. Jane's a friend of mine, and she sent me one time a little sequence of poems that are actually in her new book called The Ledger. And each of the poems begins, little soul, begins with that phrase and goes in different directions. There's 8 of them. And then when I was on vacation in St. John, the poems were circulating in my head, and I kind of wrote this as a bit of a response. So it's called A Soul for Jane Hirschfield. They call it a soul. It's not a soul. It's the feeling in the hand. Just so much cardamom, so much time. How the tongue knows to strike one syllable, bend another. Song and instrument, one and the same. How the current surges when she, almost casually, makes music of my name, makes urgency of the ordinary. Her lips touching here or mine caressing there, the tide turning, rocks below us in the cove, turning the craggy heart smooth as a stone that the soul lifts in its hand, had a soul a hand, and tosses far out into the raveling, unraveling blue. They call it a sea. It's not a sea, it's a soul. For a person who separated himself from his childhood religion, who had this endless battle from the way that I thought, made me feel nothing but shame, as if I was the cause of all these things happening. I had to create a different spiritual search and maybe even invent what I thought a soul would be. So we learn from the past. We learn from what we're willing to go inside. And then I'll end with this, 2 little poems about learning from what we get from each other. I mentioned to you that I've been enrolled, I think I said earlier on, I'm into, in a new postgraduate course named George 101. It's the best learning experience of my entire life. George is our grandson. George is now 4.5 years old. He was just over for sleepover. Why has it been such an amazing learning experience? Because now I'm going through it all over again from 0 on, except now I'm older and I know enough. The 8-year-old could not comprehend. He was grasping at straws, trying to figure out what was happening to him in the world. And at 70, I don't know a lot more, but I know a little bit more than the 8-year-old. And now I can watch George, watch how he loves learning words, how to name things, how he wants certainty. He wants predictability. He wants to be showered with love. He desires to give love. I feel like day by day with George, he's just teaching me how to be a human being all over again. So I'll read you these 2 little poems for George. Preemie, because George was born 5.5 weeks early. Preemie. Unlike us, you'd never any doubts. Everything was breast, was fullness, even the storm rattling at the windows, even enveloping cloud with sun's pert nipples showing through. Even silence was sustenance, pale lips latched on to dream swell, sucking madly. Why else had you come but to find, to be fed, to feed us in turn, as we gaze down meekly, the milky taste of the impossible? And after all, if you squeeze through that pert eyelet, might not we, though lumbering and frightened, do it too? There is a name for such astonishment. Given time, I'm certain you'll make it your own. Then croon the syllables back to us to soothe our sleep. You are nothing like us, child, but we're everything like you. He was nothing like us at the time. He had none of that baggage, none of those worries, none of those fears. He was just a pure little being. And it did our hearts good to think we were that too. And now George is becoming much more like us, learning the world. And sadly, as Lillian said at the beginning, a really troubled world for him to be in right now. And maybe somehow we have to teach him something about how to take these seemingly intangible experiences and make them real for ourselves. This last little poem is one of my favorites. It's called Supermoon. Supermoon, you probably know, is when you have what appears to be an extra large moon on the horizon. It just comes when the moon's at a certain angle to the earth. And this, I think, is maybe a hint at where my own spiritual journey was trying to lead me. Supermoon. Not the fat mandala the meteorologists were touting on the news, but a dime-sized jewel floating beneath us in the pond's black skies, which my grandson, nearly 2, snatches up in his small fist. Opening it slowly, convinced of what he possesses and by what he's possessed, he offers me his wet palm. I kiss the moon there. I'll read the last lines there again. Opening it slowly, and George opening that little tiny hand, but he already believes he can hold on to something. I imagine him believing he really could have the moon he saw in the water. Convinced of what he possesses, aren't we all in that situation? Don't we spend too much of our lives convinced of what we believe is ours, only sometimes to have it snatched from our fingers? Maybe we have to find a different way of holding on to our lives. And he said, convinced of what he possesses and by what he's possessed. I guess mother and father, family, love, that was his whole world then. He was unaware of the much larger world that possessed him too. I think we are sometimes unaware of that as well. And he offers me his wet palm, that muddy hand from the puddle. And I loved saying, I kiss the moon there. Maybe that's the one glimpse of transcendence that I get to have in my life. I know we're running a tiny bit long. I'm going to read you one last poem, but I'm going to read it to you in 2 forms as a little treat. At least I hope it'll be a treat to you. I have a recent poem called Gratitude, and I was invited to perform at a benefit for Arlington Eats. It's a food bank, a service dealing with food insecurity in Arlington and some of the surrounding towns. And they did an earlier benefit 6 months ago, and they wanted me to do just what I'd done before, but I didn't want to repeat that. So I had this new poem called Gratitude. And in that earlier time, I performed one poem live with a musician, a sax player. Turns out he was really a clarinetist, but he played sax for me. And Todd Brunel is his name. He's a wonderful musician. And we decided to make this poem into a more multi-dimensional art piece. So I'm going to read it to you so you can hear it and then show it to you in its new form. So here's a poem called Gratitude. It's written in 4 little sections, just a pause between each of them. One you'll see is a reprise from something you heard earlier. Gratitude. While sleet scarred the dark pane white, she sat at a back table in Starbucks, sipping slow from her empty cup, hour after hour And judging by the look on her face, each sip was more delicious than the last. Mathematics. 10 from Guatemala shared the 2-room, 4th floor walk up. The 5 from the night shift returned home each morning at 8, waiting for the day shift workers to vacate their beds so they too could partake in sleep's modest infinite. And still Hector managed to wire $35 most weeks to Antigua, making sure the clerk spelled it correctly. Te amo, mi querida. After the 3rd surgery, her bald head creased like a dry riverbed, the doctors let my sister know she was out of options. She proved them wrong, continued caring for her gathered family, loving the small mercies and even the waning days. Nowhere in medicine do they explain that joy, too, is an option. I can see now that the never enough I've lived with all my life was always, and much to my chagrin, more than. The never enough was not a material never enough. It was not that I was craving objects. It was that I could never do enough, or I could never be perfect enough. I could never take care of the life so well that it meant death would be barred from it. So we are all adults. We know that's an impossibility. So what can we do? We can try to tend for the things in front of us. We can maybe try to hold them with a lighter touch. And I think we can try to do what Elaine was so good at, which was sharing them. Even when Elaine appeared to be having less and less in the world, she seemed to be able to be giving more and more. It was astonishing to me. So that was not surprising. She appeared in the poem. I love the fact that this great sadness from Elaine then becomes something that's maybe more positive here. So what I'm going to do now is I have to go to share screen. Let me do that. And Lillian, tell me if are you seeing my whole screen? Are we seeing the blank screen?
I am seeing a blank screen right now,
That's
yes.
good. Okay, I'll move my cursor out of the way. So now for a second time, here's the poem, Gratitude. Hello, I'm Stephen Ratiner. I'm Arlington's Poet Laureate, and I'm happy to share a new poem with you to begin today's program. It's entitled Gratitude. It's written in 4 small sections. And I'm even happier to be able to share the poem as a poetry musical composition because of a collaboration with a wonderful musician, Todd Brunel. So here's Gratitude. While sleet scarred the dark pane white, she sat at a back table in Starbucks, sipping slow from her empty cup, hour after hour, and judging by the look on her face, each sip was more delicious than the last. Mathematics. 10 from Guatemala shared the 2-room, 4th floor walk-up. The 5 from the night shift returned home each morning at 8, waiting for the day shift workers to vacate their beds so they too could partake in sleep's modest infinite. And still, Hector managed to wire $35 most weeks to Antigua, making sure the clerk spelled it correctly. Te amo, mi querida. After the 3rd surgery,
Her bald head creased like a dry riverbed. The doctors let my sister know she was out of options. She proved them wrong. Continued caring for her gathered family, loving the small mercies and even the waning days. Nowhere in medicine do they explain that joy, too, is an option. I can see now that the never enough I've lived with all my life was always, and much to my chagrin, more than.
So let's see if I can go back to the room. Am I back here? Excellent. Thank you all for coming and listening. And I hope you enjoyed listening to some of the poems. And
Beautifully done, and so much a part of who you are, Stephen, that I feel like I know you and I know your sister by the words that you've created.